And welcome into Press Box Live. I'm Stan the Fan Charles, and sitting in with me tonight is Glenn Clark. We wanted to let you know that Press Box Live is brought to you by C3 American Exteriors. Go to their website at c3america.com. You get a brand new roof for just the cost of your insurance deductible. Glenn, I thank you for sitting in for Mr. Stein tonight.
All right,
Good to
Stan,
see
I'm happy
you.
to do it. And,
Yep.
and I really appreciate you organizing this show tonight and putting this together because I love Mel Antonen. Was somebody that was unbelievably kind to me, and to hear from people that knew Mel even better than I did, it's going to be a special show.
Yeah, well, we've got two segments of this show. We're going to do about 20 minutes with these guys who know him as a writer, and then we're going to sort of start over again, Glenn, with the TV crew from Masson. But joining us tonight is Dan Connolly of theathletic.com. Dan, thank you very much for coming on. Peter Schmuck, formerly of the Baltimore Sun, now WBAL Radio in Baltimore. And soon, when his non-compete ends, we'll get him doing something for Press Box. And Bob Nightengale of USA Today. Bob, thank you for joining us out in Arizona.
My pleasure. Thank you.
First of all, guys, I just want to throw out the first question. What kind of writer was Mel Antonen? We all know what kind of guy he was.
Yeah, when he was at USA Today, and back in the day, you know, as these guys can attest, everybody got USA Today with the notes and the columns. I mean, it was him and Rod Beaton and Peter Gammons. I mean, he was like a Mount Rushmore, and everybody read Mel. I mean, he was probably as well read as a baseball writer as there was in the country.
Dan,
I think Bob can attest a little bit. I mean, you know, at USA Today, they had inch counts before we all really knew what inch counts were, and they couldn't really write maybe as much as they would have liked to. But when Mel sunk his teeth into a feature, he did a really nice job. He was, you know, he had a really good command of language. And the thing I think about Mel as a writer, when I think about him, I think more about the kind of interviewer and reporter he was, because he really, you know, he listened so well. I think that he had, you know, a lot of people told him things, and Bob and I were talking about this previously. You know, Mark McGwire and Mel really had a really strong relationship, and he ended up, you know, doing a lot of stuff, little exclusives with McGwire. He had a situation with Rod Carew. He wrote a beautiful piece about Rod Carew and Rod Carew's family. So he had a lot of really nice pieces, you know, that he probably could have, you know, spread his wings even a little bit more.
Peter, your thoughts about him as a writer?
You know, it's funny. Mel's a mild-mannered guy who easily, when he's at an event, for us, kind of can fade into the background. He's just not a guy who's going to be out there promoting himself. But as Dan pointed out, Bob pointed out, he could get his teeth into a story. He also had this, I guess, it's just this way about him that made people like him. I don't care whether you were a player, you were an executive, whether you're another writer. I challenge you guys to name me one guy that didn't like Mel. I don't know anyone with a bad word to say about Mel. But the fact is, he wasn't his winning personality that make us remember him so fondly. It's that he was really, really good at what he did. It just kind of stuns me, and Bob can sharing this. I mean, I was thinking about Mel, and when I first met Mel, and I can't remember the exact first day because Mel's not that kind of guy where you remember the first time you met him. And yet I'm thinking about this and going, we've known each other for just under 40 years. And Mel, you know, showed up, and he was big time real quick when he came to USA Today. You know, he established himself very, very quickly, made a name for himself. And but you know, for those of us in the business, it was just that he was a friend to everybody. And even as he moved on and came to Masson, for me, you know, I knew Mel all that time, but we didn't run in the same circles except when it was the World Series or the All-Star game or whatever, labor negotiations. And I got a chance to have what I kind of called my fifth inning stretch with Mel, because Mel sat caddy corner behind me at Camden Yards, and I was at pretty much every home game, and he came to almost all of them after he finished his show. And you know how our job is, you know, when the game's going on, if I'm helping with the game coverage, I'm not going to have any time from the 6th inning on, and I'm probably going to be doing something in the first couple innings. And so we carved out that time where I'd go over and stand with my elbow on the second level barrier, and then we just talk for an inning, watch the game and talk. And it was almost never about baseball. It was always family stuff and you know, old times. And I start thinking about this stuff, and you know, I still, frankly, you guys probably all agree, I can't believe he's gone, and and it's hard to deal with.
Glenn, you got
Yeah, guys, what's one of the things that jumped out at me most is everybody's referenced Mel's sense of humor, and Mel would be a regular with me over the years on all my various shows, and we would literally make the exact same joke every time. You know, he would talk about how many jobs he was working, and he would say, "I'm going to deliver a pizza to you later, but you're a bad tipper." And it's not a funny joke, but he would laugh hilariously every time. Can you speak to, and Bob, I'll start with you because we were talking about this the other day, what his sense of humor meant, and that smile, that laugh, what it did for everybody in the baseball community.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, he would tell a joke and laugh, and you'd hear the same joke 100 times, and okay, it's not funny anymore. But the way he kept laughing, like was, you know, the greatest joke on earth, you couldn't help but laugh because you're looking at Mel's face and he's laughing. I mean, he would laugh, and you know, I used to, you know, I covered the Padres for a while. The greatest laugh was Tony Gwynn. It was just the way he laughed, you couldn't help but laugh. And Mel was the same way. Fun to be around. I mean, you wanted to make him laugh too, because you know, when you made him laugh, he would lose control of himself. You know, he would have tears in his eyes. Next thing you know, you have tears in your eyes too. Just a wonderful guy to be around, and never took himself seriously. You know, when Peter was saying what a nice guy, you know, he was. It's true. Is that he could have had the biggest ego in the world. He broke 1 million stories on that McGuire Sosa home run race, but he was the same guy. Never changed. He was a guy you would like to see in the press box, you know, as Dan and I were talking about the other day. And you know, a lot of guys say you don't really care if you see him in the press box sometimes, but he would bring you up, like your whole spirit was lifted when you saw him. And I don't remember a conversation at all. I don't know if Dan or Peter do either, where you don't come away with at least one laugh in the conversation.
Dan, I know you wrote about a lot, you know, in your piece, the Eurobit in the Athletic, about his sense of humor, even a macabre sense of humor.
Yeah, you know, and Bob's right. He just didn't take himself too seriously, and we went back and forth because I don't either, and we could say almost anything to each other. And Pete Schmuck and I are the same way, that we can just, like, you know, we know where it's coming from. We know the heart that's involved, so we can just kind of rib each other, you know, for everything. One of my favorite stories about him ribbing me was he would come up every year and do part of my talk at my church as a charity talk about hot stove baseball. And he just volunteered to come up one year, and he just kept doing it. So for 8 years, we emceed it together. And so he would come up and we would just talk. And the one year, 2015, my book was coming out, and I was supposed to sign at this charity event for the first time. And it kept getting pushed back and delayed. And we found out that it may not make it in time for the actual event. And it came like 2 hours before the event started. And the reasoning was, they said that there was an accident with the delivery truck in Chicago. And so therefore it was delayed an extra, you know, day or so. And I told people this, and Mel just, you know, in that voice of his, because his voice was, you know, unmistakable as well, he stops me and says, and you know, we got 100 people sitting there waiting, you know, listening to us. And he says, well, I heard that the driver, the reason he had the accident because he was reading Dan's book. And everyone just started laughing stuff. And then he just goes right back in and says, and he fell asleep at the wheel. And everybody in the place just lost it. And I just smiled and laughed and was like, that's great. That's hilarious. And we just kept going back and forth like that. And we could do that. As he could rib me, I could rib him. He could do that with all of us. And I think that's because you knew where it was coming from the whole time. The heart that he had was fantastic.
Peter, anything with you with a sense of humor?
Well, you know, Mel was so, you know, soft-spoken, mild-mannered, would make a lot of that, because he was. But he could put the needle in you and you didn't know it till later. He'd say something that seemed pretty matter of fact, and you're like driving home that night. Wait a minute, that was a shot. Because he's just so, I enjoyed Dan's,
And the ones who help make sure everyone
anecdote
makes it
about
home
his,
safe.
about the hair thing, when Mel had to shave his head because he was doing chemotherapy. We all have a lot of fun with Dan's what's under Dan's hat. But that was Mel all over.
I've got a real quick one myself over at Masson. I'm a fantasy baseball player, so they gave me this thing that I could do called the Fantasy Minute. And usually I would always try and get an obscure guy that was an interesting guy to pick up. But once in a while, they'd throw it to me 15 minutes before the show started. So I'd go, hey, I think like Nolan Arenado's really been hot lately. So I would do a thing on Nolan Arenado, and Mel would say, who wouldn't pick up Nolan Arenado? I mean, it just like totally punctured what you did. Glenn?
Yeah, no, it's tremendous. Guys, could you speak to what the game meant to Mel? And I think that's something that we're all kind of celebrating this week is his relationship to the baseball community. And Peter, let's go in reverse order. I'll start with you. What the game of baseball meant to Mel and why he was so attached to it for his entire life.
Well, obviously, I mean, Mel's life was a John Grisham non-lawyer novel. I don't know if you've read any of John Grisham's baseball books. Mel grew up in this tiny town. His father oversaw the amateur baseball program there, and Mel's childhood was spent rubbing elbows with the likes of Satchel Paige and Jim Perry, and also dragging the infield when he was probably 7 years old or eight years old. And it just never got out from under his skin. It just didn't. I mean, a lot of us grew up loving baseball, but we didn't grow up living it. We grew up fantasizing about it. Mel grew up very much in it and in its very roots. And I think that's part of it when it came to Mel and his love of baseball. It wasn't because baseball was this glitzy major league thing. It was because baseball was truly to Mel the national pastime on a national grassroots level. That's where he came from. A lot of us would love to have spent our childhood in that idyllic setting. A lot of us didn't get the privilege, but we certainly could live it through him. And that's another thing, again, he just sort of embodied that. So, when you learned his story, it all kind of made sense.
Dan, could you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the glitzy glam thing too, I think Pete hit on it. I mean, that wasn't what baseball was for Mel. And he was just, and you didn't know the extent of a lot of this until he told you. And I remember one time we were talking about World Series. I think it was the 1975 Carlton Fisk home run World Series. And he's like, telling me, he's like, yeah. And afterwards I ended up finishing washing the dishes with Jim Perry. I said, what? He said, well, Jim Perry was living with us. Jim Perry, former Cy Young Award winner of the Twins, was living with his family at the time. His father and Jim Perry were in business together. And so they watched the game and then they did the dishes together. And that's how Mel learned baseball, is through these greats who were just kind of like Uncle Jim. And, it was amazing to me to hear those kinds of things. And it's funny because about 5 or 6 months ago, we were just talking on the phone, and he had gone through a rough period. And we ended up talking about an All-Star game, the 1971 All-Star game. And then he starts telling me about what he thought was the best All-Star game of all time when it was in Minnesota. And we were just kind of going back and forth. And at the end, he's like, hey, I got to do chemo right now, but this was just so much fun. We need to just talk baseball again. And he was so, everyone asked him about how he was doing and everything. And really, the essence for him was just talking baseball and his memories and what I thought and stuff. And he just loved it to his core.
Can I ask Dan a question real quick?
No, of course.
Did when Mel tells the anecdote about Jim Perry, did he tell you whether Jim Perry scuffed any of the plates?
He did. He didn't. But he did say that occasionally Gaylord would come over and he would spit on the plates, and they'd have to clean them even more. So it's just a weird thing.
Do any of you, I'm just curious, I read Dan, your piece in The Athletic was absolutely phenomenal, but I read a really good piece today by Charlie Race of USA Today. And he told the story about when he was assigned at the Olympics, they had to get Ben Johnson. Do any of you familiar with that story? Bob?
I wasn't until I read it. And I think I'm not sure if he grew up with Mel, but very close with Mel and the family. And I think his wife, Lisa, Mel's wife, Lisa, kind of helped through that and guided him. So, no, I was not familiar with this story. That was a hilarious story. And I can see that happening with Mel and laughing about it, almost bragging about it. I can.
Peter, does that story resonate with you at all? It's a story where his editor told him he got to get Ben Johnson,
Yep.
the runner, and he ended up buying a ticket to Toronto from Seoul, Korea, or something like that. And it turned out it was the wrong Ben Johnson.
The doctor or something.
Yeah.
Right.
You know what's funny about this? And this is here's something that's Mel all over, and I probably shouldn't tell the story because I'm not sure it reflects well on me. But when Mel went off to do the Olympics, he had to give up the hot stove show on WBAL. Way back then, he used to do the hot stove show with Jim Hunter, and they asked me to fill in, and I don't even know the answer to this. But Mel never came back to that, and they never asked me to stop. And I've been at BAL ever since. And so after a while, it became one running gag with Mel and I that I had stolen his radio career. Now, mind you, he's had quite a radio career since then. But I always felt kind of funny about that. But it was like he never really came back. It wasn't like he came back and they didn't want him back. I think he was probably told by USA Today to concentrate when he got back on baseball and get back to baseball. He never really rejoined that show. But, if the roles had been reversed, I've probably been all over him for stealing my job. But it was always just a running kind of joke.
Hey, guys, I really appreciate your being on. We're tight on the time here because we want to do part 2 of this Remembering Mel. And it's going to be about his days at Matson on TV. We really appreciate it. Bob Nightengale of USA Today, Dan Connolly, The Athletic, Peter Schmuck of WBAL Radio. Of course, we all know him and love him from the Baltimore Sun. Glenn Clark's going to stick around with me. Thank you, guys. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you for setting it up.